Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll get started this morning. We're only going to be looking at one verse today, so we're not going to get very far, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll begin our discourse. Lord, thank you so much for your word. I'm just amazed at how your truth is just relevant, even though it was written a long time ago. It is still true today because your word is eternal. We thank you so much, God, for the wisdom and the insight that you've given to us and how we can leverage that wisdom to see things clearly in regards to reality and making wise choices and being able to see things clearly. Pray, God, that this would be productive and instructive and that overall, Lord, you would be glorified. We love you so much for it's in your son's name. Amen. Okay. Let's talk about takeaways from last week, and then we'll go into our discourse this morning. So last week we had examined Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 1 to 7. Okay? And this one was kind of unique in a sense because Koheleth was talking about vows and where to make them and how to make them, right? And that you don't want to be flippant with your vows because, again, God will hold you accountable for those, according to Koheleth here. First of all, we have to understand that this particular verse, although we can read it and kind of glean some things from it, that this verse directly is not about us. Okay? First of all, Koheleth underscored the activity that took place in the economy of law. This is under the nation of Israel. This is under the Mosaic law. They were to do these things, right, freely. If they did not do these, or if they didn't do these things freely, or if they were flippant with their words, the hand of the Lord was against them, right, because they basically did something and then, or said that they were going to do something and they didn't do it, right? Koheleth's statements were directed to the nation of Israel during his rulership. This is also important to note. Koheleth is Solomon. This is the king of Israel. He's primarily writing to the congregation of Israel concerning his outlook and their outlook and the perception that they should have. And so this is not thrown out into the general population. Okay? This is very specific and unique to them. Koheleth's statements were made during the time that there was a temple to make these vows. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 1, it says, guard your steps, or watch your steps, or your feet, rather, as you go to the house of God. This is not the house of God, according to Koheleth. The house of God was the temple, okay? The temple in Israel. And so the Levites served there, the priests served there, right? And things like that. So this statement was made during the time when there was a temple. We don't make vows. At least we ought not to. Okay? Because there's no house of God to make them. Okay? And then lastly, Koheleth mentioned or underscored the activity of the Levitical priests, right? Which I just mentioned. As he mentioned here, that as a matter of fact, in chapter 5, I think it's verse 7. No, verses 5 to 7, actually. It says, it is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Do not let your speech cause you to sin, and do not say in the presence of the messenger, all right, of God, that it was a mistake. That messenger, that word we looked at, more than likely is associated with the priests that worked within the temple. They were messengers of God, as the Hebrew scriptures say, or mentions them. Same word there. So Koheleth underscores the activity of the Levitical priests at this time. The takeaway that we had from last week, even though this particular these verses don't directly apply to us, what could we take away from here? We could take away a particular point that he continues to make in his discourse in verse 7 of chapter 5. For in many dreams and in many words, there's emptiness. Rather, fear God. Koheleth in his discourse continues to remind the congregation of Israel to have a proper perspective of God concerning their activity done under the sun. This was one of the activities that the nation of Israel did under the sun. They would make vows, right? He says, if you're going to make a vow, be intentional about making it. Understand who you're making this to, right? When a person has a proper perspective of God, found in the wisdom of God, this will serve them well in their life and their activity. Now, the hand of God is not going to be against us if, the same manner. However, God has given us wisdom to make wise choices, and we ought to regard that. If we do not regard that, things may be more difficult than they actually could be, right? Because we are using our own wisdom and our own insight to make decisions rather than being assured of the wisdom that has been given to us. So fear God is the overall goal. Now, let's go ahead and look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8 and 9. Actually, we're going to look at 9 too. Okay, this is all one thought of Koheleth, so I'm just going to lump this into verse 8. It says, if you see oppression of the poor and the denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight. For one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. That's verse 9. Okay? So Koheleth makes another observation, again, concerning what it looks like authority figures, those who have influence or power over others. And he makes an observation concerning if one sees a particular thing, that they should not be shocked at the sight. Let's take a look at a couple of words here, and then we'll break this down. Oppression is the word osek in the Hebrew. That occurs one other time in the book of Ecclesiastes, so twice overall. It is translated oppression. That's basically it. The root word is a sak, which appears in Ecclesiastes 4:1. We looked at that earlier. I'll go ahead and read it. Then I looked again and saw at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun. Right? So this word is connected to this word here, osek. So this refers to the activity of oppression rather than oppression itself being described as a particular thing. In all meaning, it means to gain or possess something from another, either by excessive manipulation or by excessive force, right? To take something from someone that someone else wants, either by manipulating them, right, by way of speech or by brute activity. I'm just going to take it from you, right? We see the subject of the oppression in verse 8 concerning the poor, right? Rus. Now, we already looked at this word before, okay? Poor, needy is how it is translated. And this word appears in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 14 as well, talking about the poor, wise lad, right? We talked about him, right? This is a person, again, who is utterly destitute or impoverished, okay? They have little to no resources, little to no influence, okay? Little to no power or ability to do anything about it. So Koheleth talks about if one manipulates either by their words or by force. This could be edicts, decrees, laws, so on and so forth, right? He tells them, if you see the oppression of the poor and the denial of justice and righteousness, gazelle, is the Hebrew term here. Twice in the Hebrew scriptures it occurs, one time here. Okay? It means either violence or plunder, to rob someone or to take something from someone. So literally, you can translate this as, if you see the oppression of the poor and the snatching, the plunder of justice, taking justice away from someone on purpose. We see this as this term actually in Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 18. You don't have to turn there. I have it up on the screen. Okay. It says, as for his father, because he practiced extortion, a sock, robbed his brother. Notice the connection here. And did what was not good among his people. Behold, he will die for his iniquity. Right? So oftentimes you see these things go together. Right? If one is extorting or if one is oppressing one, they're usually robbing. In this case, this is literal. He robbed his brother. Again, the Hebrew root word for this word is gazal. Again, to spoil, to take away, to remove, things like that. So it is the idea or thought, again, of taking away something by force. Okay? So Koheleth again brings up the oppression, that is the taking away of something against the poor, those who have little. That would make sense because no one takes away something from a strong person or from a person with great influence. They can fight back. A person who's poor can't fight back. They can't defend themselves, right? Now, Koheleth mentions what is robbed here in verse 8. If you see oppression of the poor and the denial of justice and righteousness in the province. This is kind of interesting. These words, mishpat and tzedakah, are the Hebrew words here. While Koheleth, beginning his discourse, brings up two distinct characteristics, justice and righteousness. Now, the nation of Israel was supposed to be about these, right? As a matter of fact, God mentions that he's these all the time throughout the Hebrew scriptures, that he is just and righteous. And the nation of Israel was supposed to be just and righteous in their dealings with each other. These words underscore not only the motivations of a person, but the actions of a person aligned with the law of God. The reason they were supposed to be righteous and just with each other was because they were motivated and guided by the law of Moses, whom God gave them, right? Again, these two qualities that Koheleth mentioned are often used together in the Hebrew scriptures. Kind of interesting. In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 7, speaking of the one whose government will increase, he says this, there will be no end to the increase of his government or peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness. From then on and forevermore, the zeal of the host, or the Lord of hosts, will accomplish this. Even in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 3, the very purpose of Proverbs is to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and uprightness or integrity. Some translations use equity, but I'm not using that word because that word is naughty these days. So to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, if you want to know how to conduct yourself righteously and justly, according to Koheleth, well, then read and meditate on Proverbs, right? That's one of the objectives. And as a matter of fact, in Proverbs chapter 21, verse 3, Solomon or that is Koheleth, writes this: to do righteousness and justice is desired by the Lord more than sacrifice. Right? To do what is right is better than giving a sacrifice. In Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 23 and 24, he mentions this, that is the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, let not a wise man boast of his wisdom, and let not the mighty man boast of his might, and let not a rich man boast in his riches, but let him who boasts boast of this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who exercises loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth. Again, the reason why they were to be just and righteous is because God is just and righteous, right? For I delight in these things. He delights in these things, declares the Lord. And then lastly, Jeremiah 22, verse 3, just to underscore the point, thus says the Lord, do justice and righteousness. This was the objective of Israel, to do justice and righteousness as instructed by God, and deliver the one who has been robbed of the power of his oppressor. Notice the language here. And deliver the one who has been robbed from the power of his oppressor. Do not mistreat or do violence to the stranger, the orphan, or the widow. Most of those individuals were very poor. The stranger, the orphan, and the widow. And quite honestly, whenever the nation of Israel turned away from God, who was the first people that they oppressed? The orphan and the widow and the foreigner. And do not shed innocent blood in this place. So the nation of Israel was to be guided by the characteristic and quality of God. That is, justice and righteousness, and how they were to treat each other. When a person oppresses another, justice and righteousness gets thrown aside. Justice and righteousness guides one to be fair and to see people equally under this law. When that gets removed, well, then oppression strikes. Now, Koheleth in Ecclesiastes 5 says, if you see oppression, and by the way, that see, again, is the word ra'ah, okay? So it's if you observe it, if you inspect it, if you look at it and evaluate it and see it from the perspective of God that it is oppression, okay? He says, do not be shocked. Be shocked not. This Hebrew word occurs 9 times in the Hebrew scriptures, 1 time in the book of Ecclesiastes. This is the usage here. It could be amazed or astonished or marveled. So looking at something and just being surprised or in awe of this particular thing. This word is in the active or the qual stem, and it is in the jussive. Remember, we talked about the jussive last week, the type that it is. Just reviewing it, this type emphasizes indirect commands. So it's a very general statement, not written to anyone specifically, but written to everyone who reads this, to take mind and note of it. It doesn't carry essentially the full weight of an imperative, okay? Like he must do this, but it is stronger than a suggestion. So you can translate this as, if you see the oppression of the poor and the denial of justice and righteousness in the province, you ought not to be shocked or amazed at this. Okay? Again, it is connected with the negative particle al. So it's literally shocked not or amazed not. Okay? Now, let's look at the word he said, do not be shocked at the sight. Kaphets. Okay, not heppies. Kaphets. Okay. This word is used 39 times in the Hebrew scriptures. This word is a noun, and it's a desire, a longing, or a thing that one takes enjoyment in. Do not be shocked at this particular event. Remember, it's a highly contextual word. Okay? So don't be shocked at the delight. I would translate this word event. We've already seen this word, as a matter of fact, earlier in the text, because the main point is not talking about an emotional disposition of the person. Okay? That's not what this is talking about here in this word. This is talking about the activity which a person participates or engages in. So don't be shocked at this event. If you see this, don't be surprised at this. Don't wring your hands, talk about what in the world is happening, right? Don't act surprised. Then he mentions why one should not be surprised at this phenomenon. He mentions in verse 8, if you see oppression of the poor and the denial of justice or the robbery of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at this sight or this event. For one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. Let's take a look at this word official. Gaboa, okay, is the Hebrew word. It occurs 37 times in the Hebrew scriptures, 4 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it could be translated high, proud, lofty, exceeding, abundantly. It could be used in that sense. When one uses this word, depending on the context of the word, depending on the context it's in, it could speak of something that is exceedingly high in terms of dimensions, like a wall is high, right? It could be talked about like that. Someone's affect or disposition when one is haughty or proud, right? It could be spoke of in that sense, usually it's translated proud, or high in terms of one's status or position. Okay? In this context, it is speaking of one's position over another, right? Now, this is kind of interesting. I will bring this up for the purposes of this particular discussion. Has anyone ever heard of the Solomon Asch obedience experiment? I will give you the breakdown. This is a famous experiment in psychology. Okay? Famous one. Okay? So what Solomon Asch did was he had a person who would sit on one side of a wall or a little partition. Okay? And on this wall or down here below, there were little dials. And these dials were supposed to be shock treatments. Okay? On the other side of the wall was the person who would receive the shocks themselves. Okay? Now, these shocks were not real. Okay? They used what was called the Confederate. Okay? A person who was in on it. Okay? And so this man who was sitting, or this woman who was sitting in this chair, okay, was not in on it. Okay? And Solomon Asch wanted to test to see how far a person would go, all right, to shock a person who they cannot see on the other side of the partition, just by mere fact of a person in a lab coat standing next to them, who perceived to have some sort of authority or influence. Okay? So the person, he says, the person, he would ask a question, that is the examiner. He had a clipboard and a pocket protector, you know, like all those who have experts have, right? And he asked the person the Confederate questions, and whenever he got the question wrong, the person would have to shock them. Okay? Well, to make a long story short, whenever every single person who participated in this experiment shocked the individual to the max, all the way up. And it was because this person in this lab coat, every time the person would do this, he would feel, very anxious, and he would turn to the person in the lab coat and say, "Am I supposed to do this? I'm not going to get in trouble if I do this, right?" And the person in the lab coat would go, "No, you're not going to get in trouble. Proceed with the experiment, please." This is kind of the idea here. Kovalev's point is that when a person sees injustices happening to another, one ought not to be shocked as if they don't know what they are seeing. The reason that they are seeing these things is because of the chain of command. One person does it, the other one may get in trouble for it. One person will do that, the other person will get in trouble for that. There's always someone higher who's giving the commands to another person. Always. The oppression doesn't necessarily happen for the sake of the person wanting it to happen, but because someone is over them, watching over them, making sure that they execute the commands that they were given, and so on and so forth. This is the reason why one ought not to be surprised, is because they're just following orders. Again, I find this to be rather fascinating. Again, this was written thousands of years ago, and yet we still see this happening even now, today. When you see the crushing of individuals who have no influence, and then you ask them, "Well, why did you do this? You know that this was wrong. Why did you do this?" "Well, I have to feed my family. I have to follow. I'm just following orders. That's all I'm doing." That's what he's bringing up here, the phenomena of this. Now, let's look at verse 9, or in some cases, verse 8. It's just a continuation of this thought in verse 9. "After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land." What is this? What does this mean? Especially after the point that was made here. Why is this important? Well, let us discuss this certain statement. We have to spend some time unpacking this, because it's depending on what version of the scriptures you have, you may come up with different conclusions. It's really kind of interesting. For instance, the KJV says, "After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land." The NKJV says, "Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field." What? Okay. What about the ESV? "But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields." These don't sound the same. Okay. So here's my kind of rough translation of this passage. Okay. It says, "And a profit of the land is for the all, and the king himself, the field he is served from." I tried to be as very literal as I possibly could, trying to understand the language and things like that. Cleaned up, it says, "And the profit of the land is for all, the king himself is served by the field." So if you look at some of these translations, depending upon what version that you're using, there are two possibilities. I usually don't do this, Will, but I'm going to do this. There's two possibilities that it could be, okay? And I'm going to tell you where I lean, okay? Although if you lean somewhere different, I wouldn't quibble with that. Of course, our discussion always centers around the text, but there are two possibilities, I think, just by looking and examining the text here. One possibility is that Koheleth is underscoring the benefit of a government or kingship, even during times of oppression. Um, One commentator notes this, okay, that even under a despotic, oppressive government, that even in that sense, that government is better than no government. Okay? A person makes this point by this. He says, even so, it is better to have government than not have it. And the reference he uses is Romans 13, verses 1 to 7. Okay. One translation of verse 9 is, but an advantage to a land for everyone is a king over a cultivated land. So even though you have a ruler who may be oppressive in terms of how he governs, it's better than not having one at all, right? That's possibility one, that he's discussing the benefit of government, irrespective of who's ruling. Possibility number two is that Koheleth is underscoring that even a king, even that he, oppressive or not, is served from the land that he governs over. In other words, he serves himself. He serves his own interests, his own needs. Okay. Here we go. I will give you my introduction, or we'll kind of walk through this verse, and then I'll tell you where I fall. Okay. Let's take a look at the word prophet here, okay, in verse 9. The word prophet is the word yitron, or we translate it as advantage. This word occurs 10 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. We've already seen this word itself. This word occurs in verse 1 and in verse 2. In chapter 1, Chapter 1, where it talks about what advantage does man have under the sun, right? So it could be an advantage in terms of the situation, profit in terms of the resources and things like that, or to excel in terms of an activity. Okay? Yitron. How about the word served? The word served here, or in translations here, my translation, the word is cultivate. Okay? This word is avad. This word occurs twice in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it is translated to serve, do, or work. Now, again, the word cultivate, I think, could be interpretive because of the fact of the context here, because he's talking about an advantage to the land, things like that, kind of using farming term here. The word that Koheleth uses, avad, is in the nephal stem. It is passive, but don't think of it as like an action occurring, something's happening to you. Actually, some of the passives that are in the nephal stem are reflective in nature, or reflexive rather. That the work is done to serve the other, or to serve themselves rather. So the king is laboring for himself. He's serving himself from the field. Okay? Let me tell you, based upon some of these brief observations, what I think, where I lean in terms of the possibility of this text. Just from plain looking at it and trying to figure out these things, I believe that possibility number 2 makes more sense than 1. It's more likely for me, although I could be persuaded. Let me give you several points. For one, the king would never serve or work a land directly. However, they would benefit from the land due to the citizens who are under them. The king does not labor in terms of just their overall activity, but everyone benefits from them. They give tribute to the king, they give taxes to the king, they work on behalf of the king. You could see this all throughout the Hebrew scriptures, as a matter of fact. When Solomon and things wanted to build the temple, he didn't go out there with a hammer himself. He went and got laborers, not just from his own particular province, but also from others. Okay. Two, the main point I think of this passage, depending on the context and the context that it's in, is not discussing the benefit of government. It's not. Matter of fact, you'd be surprised, Will, who made this point. I'll tell you afterwards. But the main point of this passage is not discussing the benefit of government. I don't think I've ever heard a person who is under a despotic government go, man, it's better than nothing. There are many observations from Qoheleth that do not underscore this point. Okay, this point here that a government is beneficial no matter the king or no matter the ruler. Matter of fact, in Proverbs 29:2, Qoheleth writes this: when the righteous increase, the people rejoice. Why? Because justice is served. People are treated fairly, right? But when a wicked man rules, the people groan. That doesn't sound to me like they like what they're in. This statement fits the overall language and the context here. We see the oppression of the poor, and the robbing of justice is primarily on a king who rules a nation. Just really briefly, turn with me to 1 Kings. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 10 to 18 is discussing how a ruler over the nation of Israel is going to oppress them because they rejected God as king. So the king that they're going to have is going to oppress them. But turn to 1 Kings chapter 12 right quick. 1 Kings chapter 12 is the account of Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son. Notice the language here. It says, then Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all of Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. Now when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard of it, he was living in Egypt, for he was yet in Egypt, and there he fled from the presence of King Solomon. Then they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, your father made our yoke hard. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, with which he put on us, and we will serve you. Right? So then he said to him, depart for 3 days and then return to me. So the people departed. King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you counsel me to answer this people? Then they spoke to him, saying, if you will be a servant to this people today, and you will serve them and grant them their petition and speak good words to them, they will be your servants forever. But he forsook the counsel of the elders, which he had given to him. Hey, just treat him well. You know what I'm saying? Treat him right. They'll serve you for life. And he goes, no, I'm not going to do that. And consulted with young men who grew up with him and served them. So he said to them, what counsel do you give that we may answer this people? Saying, lighten the yoke which their father put on us. Yes, because young people always give sound advice. The young men who grew up with him spoke to him and said, thus you shall say to this people who spoke to you, saying, your father made our yoke heavy. Now you make it lighter for us, but you shall speak and say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Oh, that's terrible. Whereas my father loaded you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. Now, he did that, and what happened? The kingdom split because of it. He oppressed this people. They didn't say, well, it's better than nothing. The statement concerning the highs who watch over the other highs. Remember the chain of command. I'm just following orders here. You know, if I wouldn't do this regularly, but I've got people over me, they've got people over them. Sorry. Koheleth's point is if the congregation of Israel observes or sees or inspects this type of conduct coming from those in high places, do not be surprised about this event due to their following orders. Koheleth wrote that such is the way of the activities of humanity, and that everyone profits from the land. Everyone does, but especially the king who serves himself. The purpose of a king is for them to serve others, to protect them and rule righteously. But Koheleth says often than not, that rarely happens. That rarely happens. That's like a lightning strike. Takeaways from this section. Koheleth mentioned, based upon the context of Ecclesiastes, that the crushing of those who have little influence and resources will always be the reality due to the activities of humankind. Therefore, we shouldn't be shocked that this happens. It will always be the reality until things change, which is why all of us are clamoring for righteousness and justice, really, right? Because we understand how this system works. Koheleth mentioned that the oppression will always come from those who have more authority and are just following orders. That's it. And that the king always profits from the land they govern over for his own purposes and objectives. I believe that one of the hallmarks of, just as an aside, one of the hallmarks of the millennial age is justice and righteousness everywhere. We see it in little pockets, right? But compared to the stats of history, injustice and unrighteousness is at an all-time high all the time, right? We shouldn't be shocked at these things when we see them. It shouldn't surprise us when we see activity like this. And thank God that he will fix this. And that one day this will no longer be an issue. This will no longer be true. We will continue our discourse into Ecclesiastes next week. Let's pray. Lord, these are hard truths to swallow because I think we understand how difficult the world is, and we don't want to think about it all the time. But we do, but we cannot be Pollyannish about the perspective of the world itself. That this world and the system that governs it can be very cruel. That individuals who have influence and power ought to use their power to serve others. And Koheleth mentions that that's not the case in most things. Thank you for giving us the perspective of this that we shouldn't be shocked and surprised, but that we should always, again, fear you, have proper perspective, and long for righteousness and justice to come from you. We thank you so much, Lord, and give you praise, for it's in your Son's name. Amen.